Lenny's big fingers fell to stroke her hair. "Don't you mess it up," she said. Lenny said, "Oh, that's nice," and he stroked harder. "Oh, that's nice. Look out now, you'll muss it." And then she cried angrily, "You stop it now, you'll mess it all up." She jerked her head sideways, and Lenny's fingers closed on her hair and hung on. "Let go," she cried. "You let go!" Lenny was in a panic. Her face was contorted. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed her mouth and nose. "Please don't," he begged. "Oh, please don't do that. George will be mad." She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free, and from under Lenny's hand came a muffled screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. "Oh, please don't do none of that," he begged. "George gonna say I done a bad thing, and he ain't gonna let me tend to no rabbits." He moved his hand a little, and her hoarse cry came in. Then Lenny grew angry. "Now don't," he said. "I don't want you to yell. You gonna get me in trouble, just like George say you will. Now don't you do that." And she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. "Don't you go yelling," he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. And then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from around her mouth, and she lay still. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but George will be mad if you yell." When she didn't answer nor move, he bent closely over to her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, "I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing." He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. "I done a real bad thing," he said. "I shouldn't have did that. George'll be mad, and," he said, "and hide in the brush till he come. He's gonna be mad in the brush till he come. That's what he said." Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. "I'll throw him away," he said. "It's bad enough like it is." He put the pup under his coat, and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks towards the horseshoe game. And then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky, in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last still came a shepherd bitch, lean and long, with heavy hanging dugs. Halfway a packing box where the puppies were, she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair rose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covered of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rogued cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much more than a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, Old Candy's voice came. "Lenny," he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped and his body stiffened. He rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you were here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her and, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He looked about helplessly, and he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their beddings, and they clashed the chains of their halters. In the moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he said. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up slowly and stiffly, his face was hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any ideas?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "What we gonna do now, George? What we gonna do now?" George was a long time in answering. "Guess we gotta tell the guys. I guess we gotta get 'em and lock 'em up. We can't let 'em get away. Why, the poor bastard would starve." And he tried to reassure himself. "Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him." But Candy said excitedly, "We gotta let him get away." "You don't know that, Curly. Curly's going to want to get him lynched. Curly'll get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last. "That's right, Curly will, and the other guys will," and he looked back at Curly's wife. "Now," Candy spoke his greatest fear, "you and me can get the little place, can't we? George, you and me can go there and live nice, can't we? George, can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much. I got to thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off?" Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, "I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house, or I'll sit in my pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back and work another month and I'll have $50 more." Candy said, "He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this." George still stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny never done it in meanness," he said. "All the time he done bad things, but he never done 'em out of being mean." He straightened up and looked back at Candy. "Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. They got to bring 'em in, I guess. They ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him in." He said sharply, "I ain't gonna let 'em hurt Lenny. Now listen, you guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go in the bunkhouse. Then in a minute you come on out and tell the guys about her. And I'll come along and make like I never seen her." "Will you do that? So the guys won't think I was in on it?" Candy said. "Sure, George, sure I'll do that." "Okay, give me a couple minutes. Then, and you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now." George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at the Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. "You goddamn tramp," he said viciously. "You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you messed things up. You wasn't so good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart. He sniveled and his voice shook. I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys. He paused and then went in on a sing-song. And he repeated the old words. If they was a circus or a baseball game, we would have went to her. Just said to hell with your work. Just say to hell with work and went to her. Neverest nobody say no. And they'd have been a pig and chickens. And in the winter, the little fat stove. And the rain coming. And us just sitting there. His eyes blinked with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Whit and Curly and the crooks keeping back out of the tension range. Slim and Carlson and young Whit and Curly and crooks keeping back out of the attention range. Candy came after them, and last all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat. And buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom. They stopped and stood still. They stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her, and he held her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up and the man crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. I know who done it, he cried. That big son of a bitch who done it. I know he done it. Why, everybody else was out here playing horseshoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger, and he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. I guess Lenny done it. All right. He said her neck's bust. Lenny coulda done it, coulda did it. George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. Maybe like that time in Weed you was telling about. Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. Well, I guess we got to get him. Where you think he might have went? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south, he said. We came from north, so he would have went south. I guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could keep Curly in, we might, but Curly's gonna want to shoot. Curly's still mad about his hand, and suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't gonna do no good, George. I know, said George. I know. Carlson came running. The bastard stole my Luger! He shouted, It ain't in my bag! Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys, he said. The N-word's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun!